Welcome to the AgManager Radio, brought to you by the Kansas State University Agricultural Economics Department. Our team of researchers and extension specialists are here to bring you commentary on the latest issues in agriculture.
So we have with us today Jaime Luke. Jaime is a PhD student in our program, and I've had the privilege of having Jaime in class, and I'm always very impressed with Jaime's work. So I'm going to ask Jaime now to tell us who Jaime is.
Yeah, well, thank you, Dr. B. As Dr. B said, my name is Jaime. I am a fourth-year PhD student here in the Department of Ag Economics. I'm originally from Missouri, so I grew up on cow-calf and row crop operation in Northwest Missouri. I did a couple of degrees at the University of Missouri, and now I'm here at Kansas State finishing up a PhD. I work primarily in livestock and meat markets under the direction of Dr. Glenn Tonser.
Excellent. Glenn is one of our leading beef economists in the United States, and so you are studying under someone who has all the expertise, and given your background from a cow-calf operation, you didn't deviate very much from that in doing beef research for your PhD dissertation.
Yes, sir. Yeah, so kind of kept it in the area that I've grown up in, and really enjoying getting to continue to work with different topics that are of interest to producers like my dad and brothers.
Excellent. So your recent work is on feedlot economics, related to the adoption of technologies that are meant to reduce enteric emissions. Why don't we begin with you telling us what enteric emissions are? They look like something from space or something.
Yeah, so it's, maybe not a word that you hear thrown around a lot, but again, I'm not an animal scientist, I'm an economist, but I'll do the best I can here. So enteric emissions are essentially a byproduct of feed digestion in ruminant animals. So cattle are ruminants, meaning they have a rumen as part of their digestive process. So the feed is eaten by the animal, travels to the rumen. In the rumen, there is an enzyme that is kind of a catalyst for methane production. And ultimately, that methane has to go somewhere. And so it is exhaled into the atmosphere in the form of enteric methane emissions.
I see. Well, but why are we even talking about this enteric emissions?
Yes, so enteric emissions are methane, and methane is a greenhouse gas. And of course, we've all heard over these past few years a lot of talk about greenhouse gases. So kind of in the wake of climate change concerns, there's been a lot of push to reduce greenhouse gases kind of any way we can find. And that pressure comes from a lot of different entities. So we can look to one being the US government. So here a couple years ago, the US signed the Global Methane Pledge. This pledge has the goal of reducing emissions by 2030. And it's been signed by over 150 countries around the globe. And the US is kind of a leading member of that. So finding ways to reduce methane emissions. We also see that there is a lot of pressure from the private sector. So I'm sure we've all heard of different companies that have pledged either net zero emissions or different emissions reductions by 2030 or 2040 or 2050. And so these companies are now looking at their supply chains and saying, okay, how do we actually go about reducing emissions? And then you can also see that there is pressure from consumers. So there's definitely a subset of consumers out there who have stated, they want to eat more environmentally friendly products, and they're looking to purchase those sorts of products. However, a lot of the literature has shown that that subset is fairly small. So when it comes to finding ways to economically incentivize producers to change practices, does that come from consumers? The literature says, maybe not. And so then it comes to the question of how does this happen and who foots the bill at the end of the day?
And the economics is always very important. We'll come back to that issue towards the end of our conversation. But now you've talked about net zero, and it keeps coming up in publications and in the news, but nobody is actually telling us what that means. So can you just take a minute and tell us what is net zero? When everybody says they want to get to net zero, what are they talking about?
Yes. So again, I am not, a climate scientist, but I'll do my best here.
Yep.
Essentially, along supply chains. So as consumers, we go to the grocery store or we go to, the retailer and we buy a product. But if you trace that product all the way back to its origin, there are emissions across that supply chain, whether it be from transportation of goods from one entity to another, or packaging, or the actual production itself. So for food products, what are the inputs, what are the outputs, how are emissions or different greenhouse gases being emitted along this supply chain. And there are these different breakdowns of scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions. But at the end of the day, what they're trying to do is find ways to zero out the scorecard. And that can come in a lot of different ways, and a lot of different practices can be contributing to that goal. So we think about agriculture. Agriculture has different emissions, but we also have ways to reduce emissions. So carbon sequestration, things like that are the opposite of that. So rather than increasing those emissions, we can actually be decreasing those emissions and taking away from kind of the greenhouse gases that are being emitted into the atmosphere. And so when we talk about net zero, it's finding a way to balance the emissions with the reductions to a 0 point. So basically, we're not adding to the emissions going into the atmosphere, so we're not adding to warming of the planet.
Right. So if a bee farmer is producing, let's say, 20 tons of enteric methane, and they can plant crops that can reduce greenhouse gases by 20 tons, then they are at net zero.
Essentially.
That's what we are saying. Okay.
Yep. It's a big equation.
That's right. Okay. Now, you have researched this. The Senate has a bill in place to help producers and feedlots basically address this enteric methane production and mitigate that. What are the main provisions that the Senate bill, which includes our senator from Kansas as a sponsor, is looking at?
Yeah, so it's really looking specifically at these enteric methane emissions. And kind of the two main goals, one would be to increase funding for different research that looks into things like feed additives that could reduce enteric methane emissions. So increasing funds for research. And then the second being creating some sort of voluntary program that producers could engage in to adopt some of these practices that are being developed in practice on their own operations.
Okay, excellent. So what are some of the technologies? You talked about feed additives. Where are we on that as we get closer to 2030 and this net zero thing is coming, and the beef industry has already made some promises about reductions? Where are we on the technology scope?
So there are quite a few products that are in development or to the stage that they're waiting for approval. So the one that my research has looked at a lot is a feed additive called 3-nitrooxypropanol, or 3-NOP. And this product is unlike a lot of other feed additives that producers might be more familiar with, in that the main reason for its existence is that it reduces emissions. So rather than being, production driven or along those lines, so increasing feed efficiency and things like that, it's marketed just as a way to reduce emissions. And kind of, again, how this additive works is it travels to the rumen and basically shuts off that enzyme that would be going on to create methane. And so there's just less methane created at the end of the day. And if you have more questions about that, I would talk to an animal scientist. So yeah, that's kind of the one that I've looked at. There are others that maybe folks have heard about. So seaweed has been one that's gotten a lot of attention in the media as well. The economics of seaweed can be kind of an interesting story, given seaweed isn't really grown where the cows are, so not a lot of seas around Kansas. But there are quite a few products that are potentially going to be coming to the market here soon. So back to that 3-NOP. It's received approval for use in dairy production in the U.S., but not quite yet for beef production. So maybe forthcoming, but that's still kind of in the hands of the U.S. FDA.
All right. So then let us pause a minute and see how the introduction of this technology could affect the beef industry. Have you seen anything already since it's been approved in dairy? Have we seen any reports on its effect in the dairy market or dairy production?
So I haven't yet. I mean, it was just approved in dairy maybe a couple months ago. So
okay,
very recent.
very recent.
Yeah. So I haven't heard anything yet about kind of that uptake. Yeah.
All right. Excellent. Just a minute. Well, so we will pause here. So we have with us Jaime Luke, who is a PhD student in the Department of Agricultural Economics, Kansas State University, who is doing work with enteric methane emissions and looking at the economics of it for beef feed yards and beef producers in general. So Jaime, welcome back.
Thank
you. Let us continue our conversation. You've done the background work and all that, and then you, like a true applied economist, went to the market and went to the industry and talked to people and collected their views instead of sitting in your lab or sitting in your office and making things up. This is what I like about the applied economics we do at Kansas State University. So you talked to some beef producers about this whole area of enteric methane emissions and the technologies that are coming out and their potential effects. Can you tell us about your survey and who was involved in it?
Yeah, sure. So I guess it started all with some stakeholder interviews. So my advisor and I went out and interviewed different folks in the beef industry to kind of get a pulse for their thoughts on this topic of enteric methane. And what we found is it's something that people are aware of in the beef industry, but maybe not something that's front of mind, especially given kind of where we are in the cattle cycle, how, droughts have been affecting beef producers recently. There are a lot of really important economic questions that are facing beef producers right now. And given, maybe the economics behind this, as we'll talk about here in a bit, aren't as dire as they are in some other areas. It's something that is definitely on the radar, but not maybe front of mind. So given that, I wanted to develop some sort of tool that we could gauge, a little bit more broadly, kind of the feedlot sector's kind of maybe interest in this topic, but also what their adoption could potentially be of a tool to reduce emissions. So we developed a survey that was sent out via Feedlot Magazine, and then also some other state associations in some of the major feedlot states. And kind of what the survey was an opportunity for producers to say, okay, given this is the scenario, so we have this product, 3-NOP, that will potentially be coming to market. If there were certain incentives in place, how would you react? Would you adopt this? Would you not adopt this? And we varied the treatment. So different producers got, different incentive levels, incentive sources, different costs of the product. So we could see, as researchers, we don't actually know how the rollout's going to be or what the potential incentives could be. But given different scenarios, how would producers react? And so it was just kind of an effort, a first stab at trying to figure out the economics kind of behind this livestock emissions question.
Right. And what was the level of awareness of this enteric methane emissions among your producer respondents?
Yeah, so we found that it's something that most producers had heard about. Potentially they've heard about different methods. But while they've heard about it, most of them hadn't done anything on their own operation to address it. And then we followed up that question by saying, in the future, do you think you'll have to? And that we've kind of got a mixed bag. So about 50% said yes, 50% said no. A lot of people were unsure. So kind of, I would say where the state of the industry was at the time of the survey was, we know about it, we've heard about it, we haven't done anything about it yet, and we're not sure if we're going to have to.
Right. And we know that, in all these, advocacy initiatives that are changing agriculture because of other things that are happening globally, economics is a primary driver. And that is one of the things that your research is looking at, who pays. So if it has value to consumers, they'll pay. If it doesn't have value to consumers, but people think it's important, they're going to make it into policy and get, the results they are looking for. And your research seems to support that, because you ask consumers, how much are they willing to pay? And then you ask voters how much they are willing to pay. The way that I see the difference, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Jamie, is that the voter doesn't have any budget constraint. I mean, they are just, talking as a citizen, whereas the consumer has a budget constraint and therefore looks at how their needs or their demands are going to affect their own pocketbook. And you got some very interesting results from asking, those two people, the consumer and the voter, their response to this issue. What did you hear?
Yeah, so kind of on the voter side of things, what we found is we presented it as a question of, to half the people, would you vote for a mandate in this area? So just mandating producers to reduce emissions. And the other half, we said, okay, would you vote for a subsidy? So that area would, take taxpayer support. And so what we found is, if we asked the mandate question, and then we followed it up with, this is likely going to increase the price of beef, the voters were more willing to vote for a subsidy as compared to a mandate. And so once again, we tied it back to that constraint of a consumer's budget, then all of a sudden they were less willing to vote for different policies in this space. Right. And then going further, you have to look at, consumers. So in economics, there's kind of this phenomenon of a vote buy gap. So residents say, yes, I'll vote for this. But at the end of the day, if the prices are higher in the grocery store, maybe they're not willing to pay for it. And so there's this gap between what citizens want versus what they're actually willing to pay for at the end of the day.
Yeah. And that is real. I mean, that is a real issue, because sometimes, we had done some work earlier on in my profession where we asked people a very similar question. Do you buy this product? Yes. And then they come out and you say, did you buy the product? Well, they didn't buy it. And that's because their budget constraint kicked in. And that is when this whole idea between the citizen and the consumer in the same person emerged, right? Mm-hmm. Because in one situation, as a voter, they are a citizen. And if we're going to be taxed for it and it's not going to directly come from my pocket, it doesn't really affect me. Let's do it. But then if you're going to increase the price and I have to pay for it, then probably think about passing it on to somebody else. And we see that. So here, producers are going to be confronted with this challenge. And we've seen these things come over and over again. And the agriculture industry is facing that across, the whole country and probably the world at the moment, especially the developed world. California has Prop 12 that has already been implemented. Massachusetts is looking at it, and all the implications of that for producers in making their decisions, right? Mm-hmm. So the question that I want us to close by for, just your thoughts as you're studying this thing and some of the things that are coming. What are the factors that producers should be taking into consideration if there is no mandate for them to do this before they start adopting these technologies? What should they be thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all is understanding the economics of the situation. So there are lots of different examples throughout history in the beef industry of products that have been developed and the science checks out. It all makes sense. The government has given its blessing, it's approved and everything. But then when it was put on the shelf and it was marketed to producers, the economics didn't check out. And so ultimately those products really haven't seen the light of day. And so as a producer, specifically with this topic, and I think it's even more important with this topic because it's hard for a producer to think about enteric methane emissions since you can't see them, they're not tangible. And so adopting a product is going to have to make economic sense for a producer before it's actually going to happen. So, if I'm a producer, understanding how I could potentially generate some sort of profit from doing this practice is super important. And that can come in a lot of different ways. So whether that's from a processor who comes to you and says, hey, we'll, give you this product and give you a premium if you use it. That's a way to generate it. Or maybe the US government says, okay, we'll give you a subsidy if you use this product. There are a lot of different avenues that could potentially become, tangible here in the future. But definitely understanding kind of the economics and then also the expectations of adoption. So when you look at the US beef industry, it's highly segmented and calves can change ownership multiple times. If you're a cow-calf operator, you wean your calves and you sell them to maybe a backgrounder, and then that backgrounder will put some weight on them and then they'll go to a feedlot. And so there's all these ownership changes. And so if you're going to adopt a strategy somewhere along that supply chain and want to get an economic return for it, how do you make sure that as that animal travels through the supply chain, that at the end of the day, you're still the economic returns are going to come back to you. And, that opens up more doors of, traceability and verification and all of these things that I think we're going to have to work through if there is actually going to be adoption in this area going forward. So yeah, I think, just sitting down and penciling through kind of the why would I do this and does this make sense? And then I think there's also, especially when you have new products, there's the risk factor. So unknown products, the science can say that this checks out and everything, but just being willing to know that if it's not a widely adopted product, you may be one of the people who's like learning how to implement this, and there may be a learning curve there, and just I guess being willing to open your mind and understand some of the things that come with adopting new technologies, which of course is a very practical thing that producers face all the time. So yeah, I think just having that open mind, but also at the end of the day, realizing that the economics of the situation have to make sense.
Excellent. So in the absence of a mandate, producers should sit down and pencil out whatever the cost is in implementing this technology and the potential benefits they will get at the end. If the net benefit is positive, they might consider adopting it. If it is negative, then it wouldn't make economic sense for them to do it if there is no mandate. If there is mandate, then we have to think about who pays. Maybe the government can support it, or some company can demand it and therefore pay for it. But the economics is what is critical, because we have to keep beef farmers and agriculture as a business maintaining its profitability as we go into the future. We have to feed people, don't we?
Yes.
Excellent. Well, Jamie, thank you very much for the time you've taken to tell us about your research. And we look forward to talking to you again when you've got some more results on some of the cool things that you are working on.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you, Dr. B.
All righty. Talk to you again soon.